Hello everyone, welcome back to AI and the Human Mind. Every day there seems to be breaking news about AI. The world is changing very fast. But how fast? What might we expect? Well, this is what I want to look at today. I want to do so by looking at the phenomenon known as exponential growth. This is extremely important in the area of AI. You may have heard about Moore's Law. It's named for the co-founder of Intel, Gordon Moore. He proposed that every 2 years the number of transistors in a microchip doubles. This is one example of exponential growth, but let's try and visualize this power of the exponential in more general terms. One classic way this has been done is with a tale. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there was a wise and generous king. One day a humble servant approached the king and presented him with a game called chess. The king, intrigued by the game, was delighted and asked the servant what he desired as a reward for introducing him to this wonderful new entertainment. The servant asked for a reward that was seemingly modest: 1 grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, and so on, doubling the number of grains of rice for each subsequent square. The ruler, amused by this seemingly small request, granted it. However, as the servant began to place the grains of rice on the chessboard, the ruler quickly realized that he had promised more than it appeared at first. You see, by the time the servant reached the 20th square of the chessboard, he required over 1 million grains of rice. By the 40th square, the number had risen to over 1 trillion. And by the 64th and final square, the number of grains of rice required was a staggering 18 quintillion. This is enough to cover the entire surface of the Earth several times over. In fact, it would take around 28,000 years rice production from the entire planet to match the number of grains on the final square of the chessboard. One of the facts that makes the power of the exponential growth so difficult to understand is this massive escalation in numbers. In fact, these numbers are so difficult for us to understand at an intuitive level that we're going to try this one more time. And we're going to be focusing only on the first few squares on the chessboard. And we are going to talk about intelligence. One of the most popular ways to measure intelligence, of course, is with an IQ test. IQ follows a standard distribution, also known as a bell curve or a Gaussian distribution. In such a distribution, 68% of the population falls within one standard deviation, and 95% of the population falls within 2 standard deviations. Now keep this in mind as we place 1 grain of rice on the first square on the chessboard, symbolizing 2 standard deviations from the mean, or an IQ of around 70. In other words, somebody who's quite severely mentally impaired. We move quickly on to the next square on the chessboard, placing 2 grains of rice to represent regular human intelligence, where most people fall on the IQ spectrum. And we move on again to the third square, placing 4 grains of rice to represent 4 standard deviations from the mean. This would equate to an IQ of around 160, what some people believe that Einstein might have had. We move on again to the fourth square, placing 8 grains of rice, and this would then represent around the highest IQ ever recorded, an IQ of around 230. There are some candidates to who that might be, but around that area. And now that I'm going to have a few more grains of rice on the next square, I have prepared them just like a fancy cooking show. On the next square, where we have 16 grains of rice, this would correspond to an IQ, if we consider this 16 standard deviation, it would correspond to an IQ of around 320. Yes, of course, these numbers are far beyond what this scale was meant to measure. In fact, the probability for this happening is absolutely minuscule. You remember the Earth being covered in those trillions grains of rice from before? Well, the probability of having an IQ this high, it's about as likely as you picking out one particular grain of rice from those trillions. But let's move on to the next square, where we place 32 grains of rice. And let's consider for a moment the distance we have already covered. What would this even represent, do you think? The distance from chimpanzees to humans? Is it greater than that? Hard to imagine. And what about the next square? Where we place, if I can fit it on one square, it already becomes difficult. So we're already beginning to see some of what can happen with exponential growth. Let me try and put this pile here. 64 grains of rice, very fitting, the number of squares on a chessboard. What is this creature? What is this creature? Is it smarter than us combined already? Who's to say? But it becomes hard to imagine what this sort of mind might even be. Now you might be wondering, what about something like ChatGPT-4? What is it for in this scale? What is its IQ? Well, various tests have been tried and the results vary from around 80 to 152 IQ. The latter only in verbal intelligence, that is. But the truth is, it is very hard to test. For one thing, a lot of IQ tests are online, so they may actually have been part of the test sets that it has been trained on. But, well, let's be conservative and say that it has an IQ of around 80. Do you remember the first square on the chessboard, where we started? As we can see, exponential growth can be deceiving. It doesn't follow the usual patterns we're accustomed to in other parts of our lives. It is not a steady linear acceleration like, say, a car speeding up. In fact, it's more like taking a nice, quiet Sunday stroll and then suddenly strapping on to a rocket ship. This is what makes exponential growth so fascinating. How we can start from seemingly insignificant changes and achieve remarkable outcomes. That's all for this time. See you in the next video.